On October 30th, 1922, the Kenilworth Historical Society held its first meeting in the home of Mrs. Helen Sears on Waverly Place. The village was only 30 years old, but following the death of Joseph Sears, Dr. Rufus Stolp initiated the society to preserve its history while many of its earliest residents were still living. 80 people gathered that evening for dinner and speeches. Some traveled all the way from the East Coast, including Dr. Gerhard Mars, first minister of the Kenilworth Union Church, and Dr. Charles Smith, first secretary and creator of Kenilworth's iconic logo. Both men spoke. Dr. Smith, who was in charge of sales, recounted how he persuaded James Culbertson to buy.
He then put forth the following unusual question. Doctor, I intend to make Kenilworth my home, but how am I to feel sure that all the promises in regard to high character and maintenance of the property will be fulfilled? I told him, all I can say is that I may not have very much money, but all I have invested in Kenilworth because I believe in Mr. Sears.
Ann Higginson Spicer, founder of the Kenilworth Garden Club, also spoke.
The long blue line of the lake was the possession of everyone before it was cut off by growing trees and the increasing number of houses.
If there was a headliner that night, it was Helen Sears herself. 80 years old, frail, and painfully shy, she had never spoken publicly. Her children were on hand to fill in for her should she decide to back out. But if she was nervous, no one could detect it. With poise and clarity, she recalled the first time she saw the land.
I saw only a thick tangle of woods, reaching from the Mahoney farm to the North Road, then nothing more than a wagon track winding through the forest. Along the lake was a cleared area under cultivation, a few frame houses and clumps of orchard trees still bearing witness to the thrifty farms of the former occupants. A summer spent in England several years before was still fresh in our minds, and the more we recalled the lovely Warwickshire country and the little hamlets buried in trees and hedges and climbing roses, the clearer the picture grew. "We'll call it Kenilworth," my husband said.
After that first night, the annual Historical Society dinners were held in the Assembly Hall. As founder and first president, Dr. Rufus Stolp organized the event. And he also spoke, having jotted down a few recollections on a series of index cards. And this is what he said.
My first recollection of what now is the village of Kenilworth date back to my early boyhood, some 40 years ago. I was living in the house in which I was born and in which I lived until I was married. This house is on the corner of Forest Avenue and 13th Street, then called Gage Street. There was one house on Elmwood Avenue, 1 block north of Forest, and only 3 houses on Greenwood Avenue, 2 blocks north of Forest. Between the Northwestern Tracks and the Lakeshore Road, now Sheridan Road. There were no paved streets in Wilmette. Davis Street in Evanston was the only graded street with ditches on each side. Between Chestnut Avenue in Wilmette and Winnetka, east of the railroad tracks, there were perhaps a half-dozen log houses. The Becks, Mahoneys, Smiths, Dershams, Phillips, and Doyle, mostly on the bank of the lake. The rest of the land was thickly wooded, Gage's Woods, with here and there a meadow. This tract of land had the same sort of fascination to me then that the wildest places in the U.S. have for me now. Butternut and hickory trees and hazel bushes furnished us with all the nuts we wished to gather. And sometimes the job of sitting behind the kitchen stove with an old flat iron between my knees cracking nuts for some special dinner my mother was giving was quite a welcome task. Flowers and berries grew in profusion through the woods. Cowslips, lady slippers, white violets were among the choicest. Birds were very numerous. Snipe was shot by the hunters every year during the fall. Eagles were often seen. Hawks were always striking our garden during the day, and weasels at night. I remember that we had a large number of fur-bearing animals, especially a little black animal with a white streak down the middle of its back. As I remember, most of the farmers along the lake farmed only small tracts, so that most of the land was timberland or open meadows. There were no milkmen. Most of the residents of Wilmette kept cows and pigs. Father always had 2 cows, and Mother sold milk to some of our neighbors who had none. One of my sisters was to deliver the milk. As soon as I was big enough, I did the milking and delivering also. Our pasture lot was not big enough for the cows grazing, as was the case of many other Wilmette families. Herding cows was one of the occupations of the bigger boys of Grosse Pointe. Our cows were added to the herd as it passed our house every morning, going up 13th Street to Gage's Woods and what is now Kenilworth. During the berry time, my mother would give one of the cowboys a milk pail as he passed in the morning and tell him to bring back red or black raspberries or blueberries. In the evening, when he brought the cows home, he would have the milk pail full of the specified berries, for which he charged from 15 to 25 cents. The Skokie Ditch always carried a great deal of water to the lake, as did the big ditch that ran past our house on Forest Avenue from the Ridge to 10th Street and past Mahoney's farm. The land east of the ridge was all drained into the lake in open ditches. I remember a well located about where the Joseph Sears School now stands. It had a pole fence around it to keep out the cows. It seemed to have a great attraction for some bad boys of Wilmette who for several years made annual pilgrimages to it through the dense woods with destruction in their hearts. In the early 90s, the residents of Wilmette and Winnetka were astonished by the beginning of a new village between them, with all city improvements, paved streets, sewers, water, gas, cement sidewalks, etc. The Kenilworth Company was sinking more money in a swampy piece of land that had been spent in either village. arose a feeling in the little village of Wilmette that Kenilworth was putting on airs and that the procedure would be a failure. Land was plentiful and cheap and was not selling. In 1892, I entered rugby school, making, as I remember, the 5th scholar, the other being Phil Sears, Guy and Bernie Gossman, and Joe Sears. School was held in the old frame farmhouse on Sheridan Road south of Kenilworth Avenue, known to most of you as the Hadley House. During my 3 years' attendance at rugby, I became acquainted with the Sears family, and Phil and I became very warm friends on account of our having many likes in common. I also met many of the Kenilworth people, the girls at Mrs. Babcock's school, and was often included in the parties of the Kenilworth young people. I distinctly remember that some of the Kenilworth girls, Clara Martin, May Hinman, May Coggin, seemed to take a delight in riding horses back to Kenny's grocery store, the only one in Wilmette, to buy 1 cent worth of candy. I worked in this store during the summer of 1893. They always seemed to come in just as I was filling stove cans with kerosene, one of the principal articles then sold by the grocery store. Everyone used kerosene lamps and stoves in the summertime in those days. The rugby school by this time had increased rapidly in numbers, and the rugby school and master's houses were built the year before I graduated. Phil went to Yale, and I started to medical school in 1894. When I finished medical school in 1897, Mary and I were married and located in Wilmette. Up to this time, Kenilworth had had 2 physicians. The first one, Dr. Keeler, was no more rushed with practice than the average young MD located in a very small community. He would sit in his office waiting patiently for someone to get sick or have an accident, just as long as he could stand it, and then shut up shop and go to Chicago. Then something would happen. Maurice Parker would develop scarlet fever, Joe Sears would break his leg, or some of the Martins would get sick. It was very discouraging for the doctor to come home and find the only case in Kenilworth had developed during his absence and someone else had to be called. So he gave up the location for a more densely populated place. The next MD that Mr. Sears persuaded to locate in Kenilworth was Dr. Kaiser. He and his wife lived over the store. He developed quite a practice and was liked by everyone, but illness made it necessary for him to move to Colorado, which he did in the spring of 1898. Mr. Sears did not want the village to be without a doctor of some sort. In fact, I think that the ads of the Kenilworth Company promised conveniences like gas, water, paved streets, grocery market, and a local physician. So in order to keep his word, when Dr. Kaiser had to leave, and being unable to find anyone else, he asked Mary and me to come to Kenilworth to locate. He felt somewhat justified in this because he knew my father, and relied on him to help me out in case I might have become very sick. So Mary and I moved to Kenilworth over the store in April 1898. The store was situated then a few feet from the Northwestern Railroad track south of the station. Our bedroom window was just opposite where the southbound engine stopped, and the prevailing westerly winds of summer kept Mary's new bird's-eye maple bedroom suite covered with a thick layer of soft coal dust from the engines. But this did not last long. Mr. Sears started at once to build a house for us to rent whenever we chose. We chose to rent, but were soon persuaded to buy. It was easy for young people to purchase homes of Mr. Sears. All one needed was about $150 and a life insurance policy. So, with Mr. Sears's encouragement, my father's experience to fall on when I was puzzled, I started practicing medicine in what was formerly my boyhood's misted forest.